Hello and welcome to Dialogue. It's been 3 years since the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, a crisis that has had a devastating impact with far-reaching consequences for the entire world. In recent days, we've seen peace efforts begin between the US and Russia to end the crisis, but without the EU and Ukraine participation. Many wonder if a deal can be reached. In light of the US policy shift, do we have a clearer understanding of the root causes of this conflict? How has it fundamentally reshaped our concept of global security and economic order? And what lies ahead for Ukraine and the EU as the Trump administration shifts towards Russia? And finally, what is the best way to bring the crisis to an end? That's our topic today. I'm Xu Qianduo.
For many Ukrainians, the country is fighting for survival, while torn between a deep desire for victory and the urgent need to end the suffering.
Every time I come here, I see how much this place is growing. It compels you to work harder, to take action, to do something.
For me personally, I would accept an agreement, some kind of treaty for them to withdraw their troops. But in any case, I think negotiations are necessary, even if they happen in the West, just to bring this to an end sooner. It's hard to live in constant fear.
We've heard similar calls for peace in Russia, where citizens expressed concerns about everything from loss of life to inflation.
It's time to negotiate. Everyone is tired of the war, tired of it all. I think that's why most people are now pacifists. Many had deep personal ties to Ukrainians, but those have since fallen apart.
In Ukraine, a Gallup poll conducted in late 2024 suggests that 52% of respondents expressed a desire for their country to negotiate an end to the conflict as soon as possible.
You have to have a clear security guarantee that will say, if Russia attacks again, then everybody will be on the Ukrainian side and will protect Ukraine. Otherwise, it will continue. Otherwise, we will have a ceasefire, and it will last for 1 month, and then the war will continue.
This is a course that Russia has firmly opposed.
The West forgets that one of the main reasons for the outbreak of the conflict was precisely his obsessive desire to drag Ukraine into NATO.
While NATO leaders have claimed that Ukraine is now on an irreversible path towards membership, no formal invitation has been extended. In February, Ukraine's NATO aspirations were dealt a fatal blow by the Trump administration.
The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement.
They've been saying that for a long time, that Ukraine cannot go into NATO, and I'm okay with that.
And it's an almost complete reversal of what the Biden administration was doing in Ukraine.
President Trump had been the first of all Western leaders who said that dragging Ukraine into NATO was one of the main reasons of what is going on.
The conclusion of this 3-year conflict does not seem to be something Ukraine can determine on its own with Russia. The world is watching how parties involved navigate the situation. The clock is ticking.
Joining me today are Andrey Kortunov, former Director General and Academic Director of the Russian International Affairs Council, Peter Zalmayev, Director of Eurasia Democracy Initiative, Anton Fedyashin, Associate Professor at American University, and Ulrich Brückner, Monnet Professor for European Studies at Stanford University. Welcome to the show. Peter, I will start with you. You are based in Kiev. We are, the third anniversary of the war. What's the sentiment, of the public sentiment, among the people of Ukraine?
Well, indeed, I think it's very symbolic that, this is the 3rd year anniversary of the war, and the United States president has decided to essentially parrot the Kremlin's propaganda about who started the war, about Zelensky's popularity rating, about how he needs to hold elections, etc., how Ukraine is guilty of all mortal sins and there will be no country unless it comes to the table very quickly. It's particularly saddening that it's happening on this anniversary. Ukrainians are feeling that's a historical stab in the back. And so right now, the only hope is Europe. If Europe will finally fully wake up to the reality of living in a very multipolar and very confusing world and support Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Also, Professor Brückner, as Peter said, it seems like it's up to the Europeans. Ukraine's only hope is in the Ukraine, in the EU, probably collective choice, political commitment, and most importantly, action. Do you see what's happening in the EU, and is there this needed commitment and also action?
Well, I'm afraid even if everyone is talking about the wake-up call at the Munich Security Conference, it hasn't really fully understood what happened there. This is practically the end of NATO because American representatives lectured Europeans that we are not worth being defended and that there is nothing to expect from the United States to guarantee whatever result, no matter if you call it a peace agreement or just a ceasefire, will be supported by American troops. So there are security guarantees missing, but most importantly, the collective security promise that an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. This hasn't fully been understood. And given the situation within NATO, that the United States spends more than 800 billion on defense, and the second largest member of NATO is Germany with not even 10% of this. The Europeans, even if they would double their expenditure on defense, cannot quickly balance the removal from the United States in this collective security architecture. So it looks pretty bad. We thought the worst case is a new administration will throw Ukraine under the bus. But now the worst scenario is more likely that also the Europeans are thrown under the bus.
Mm-hmm. Andrey, speaking from Moscow's point of view, how do you look at the conflict, and in particular, if you look at back 2022 or 2014, and tell us, what's the view, what's the current sentiment in Moscow?
Well, I would venture to say that the current sentiment in Moscow is expectation management. They understand that something is changing and that the Trump administration so far has exceeded expectations in the Kremlin. However, you never know with Donald Trump. He's impulsive, he might change his mind. And of course, we should also keep in mind that a lot of military assistance for Ukraine from the United States has already been front-loaded. The Biden administration did everything it could in order to make sure that Ukraine has enough hardware and enough ammunition to fight for at least a couple of months, maybe for 2025. So I wouldn't say that there is euphoria in Moscow about a very fast conclusion of this conflict. But of course, the mood is changing, and the mood is changing quite fast here.
Mm-hmm. Well, Anton, if we look back 2022, and even 2014, as I said, and given what's happening right now, is the war avoidable? And what are the root causes?
It depends on how far back and how philosophical we want to get about the conversation. I mean, on the broadest level, for me as an historian, what's fascinating is that we are living through a massive tectonic transition from a Western-dominated world to an era of multipolarity in which non-Western actors are beginning to have a say in the rules by which the geopolitical and geoeconomic game is played in the world. Now, the countries that were unlucky enough to either get caught or maneuver themselves right onto the fault lines of this massive geopolitical transition, such as Syria and Ukraine and others, ended up suffering horribly for what is going on more broadly. Now, to be a bit more specific, because that's really the bird's eye view of what's going on in the world now, to be a bit more specific, the Ukraine war is an outcome of NATO expansion and the profound disagreements about Western Eurasian security architecture. And this will be, I think, ultimately the purpose and the main goal of Russian negotiations, first with the Americans, then with the Europeans and the Ukrainians, although we're seeing it happen in different stages. But both the Russians and the Chinese are interested in really renegotiating and reconceptualizing Eurasian security outside of the NATO framework. Now, how long this will take, this is an open question, but as the Chinese say, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single footstep, and it looks like that footstep has been taken. We'll see how fast the pace will unfold.
Professor Brückner, I know that for a lot of people, they would say this is because of NATO expansion in terms of the causes of the conflict, and Americans used to say it's a Russian invasion. So look back, do you think that's understandable? There's a concern in Moscow with NATO expansion.
Every country has the right to express its security concerns and to be listened to. This does not legitimize to invade an innocent country or to ignore the sheer existence of the sovereignty of a neighboring country. This is by no means legitimate, and therefore to find something like a middle ground, oh, they did this wrong and they did that wrong, simply doesn't allow to ignore international law and the integrity of the sovereignty and the territory of a neighboring country. Having said this, apparently, it's not a problem to have Sweden and Finland that has more than 1,000 kilometers shared border with Russia, which does not cause an existential threat to Russia, but apparently Ukraine does. So this is simply a different understanding of there are powers in the world that believe that they set rules and others have to follow, and not that every sovereign state in the world has the right to choose whether they want to join an economic organization or a military organization. If this steps on the toes of someone who feels superior, then this gives legitimacy to invade and destroy and to kill on a large state, what we have seen now in the last few years. So I don't buy this NATO expansion argument, because it isn't NATO that couldn't wait to become bigger. That makes the organization far more complicated to maneuver. It's harder to find efficient decisions. All of these parliamentary armies need the vote of the demos, and the demos had so many different things on the priority list than flirting with an idea to attacking the second largest nuclear arsenal in the world. This is complete bogus, and it follows a different idea. Putin wants to rewrite history and wants to restore the dignity and pride of the Soviet Union. This is in essence the root cause, and not anything that happens in a neighboring country like Ukraine.
Peter, let's take a look at the past 3 years, the impact, for example, impacts of the conflicts on Ukraine. Last December, Kiev disclosed the first total casualty figures, showing the loss of some 43,000 soldiers killed in action and some 370,000 wounded. Can we say there's a devastating effects on the people? Obviously, there was a talk of lowering this conscription age to 18, from Washington in the Biden administration there. So, is it sustainable for the country, especially at this point? There's a lot of pressure, obviously.
Probably, if Ukraine were to continue fighting alone, it wouldn't be sustainable in the pretty near term. But that's why I'm talking about the necessity to get Europe involved much more muscularly. And I think Keith Starmer's, UK's Prime Minister's statement that UK would send to Ukraine its peacekeepers, several thousand, and Macron, the French president, has hinted at a similar measure before. Those are all steps, that's rhetoric in the right direction. But once again, just keep in mind that when you hear about the bleeding Ukrainians, and you heard it from Putin all this time, from his minions, and now from Donald Trump, That is Kremlin's talking point, as if Russians are not dying, as if Russia is not losing 1,000 people on the battlefield every day and has had to rely on North Korean soldiers. What does it tell you? But everyone needs to hear about Ukrainian dead. Once again, let's not be manipulated by Russian propaganda.
Here, Anton, I think Peter made a good point here. North Korean soldiers, obviously, their appearance in Russia, that means, Russia has to somehow seeking help, assistance from Iran, from North Korea, obviously, there. So that means there's a huge impact probably on Russia too.
Yes, of course there is. Russia's also losing soldiers. I'm still waiting to see evidence of massive amounts of North Koreans fighting for the Russians, because no one has been able to actually find many of them at all. But the fact that the Russians have purchased material from North Korea and from Iran in the early stages of the war is quite probable. But then again, the Russians are running around the world and asking for free materials. So their industry, as Western newspapers have admitted on multiple occasions, is producing more than enough of what they need. But it's in everyone's interest to make this war come to an end. But in order to do that, the Ukrainian leadership will have to agree to come to the negotiating table. By the way, President Zelensky is going to have to abrogate his own decree from the 2nd of October of 2022, which forbids any Ukrainian official from conducting negotiations. But everyone's suffering as a result of this war. And the faster that we move towards a negotiated settlement, the better it will be. First and foremost for Ukraine, because of course, the predominant amount of destruction is happening on Ukrainian territory.
Well, Andrey, if you look at the changes, of course, the most important factor seems obvious. The U.S. was the strongest supporter of Ukraine, and now there's a change of policy. How do you look at this policy change of Washington, basically restoring ties with Russia? Seems they are doing that at the expense of Ukraine, at the expense of the EU, without their participation. What's behind the consideration of the Trump administration here?
Well, I think that it would be wrong to call Trump a pro-Russian leader. He is not pro-Russian, he is pro-American in the way how he sees American interests. And I think that for him, this conflict is an irritant. It's a distraction. It doesn't affect the U.S. core security interests. Trump would like to focus on something which is much more important for him. That includes the Western Hemisphere. He talks about Canada. He talks about Panama Canal. He wants to get Greenland. And of course, China remains his key concern. He believes that China is the only strategic rival to the United States, and he has to fix relations with Beijing. Moscow, in relative terms, is not that important, but it's important to make sure that Moscow will cease to remain an irritant. And of course, he cares about U.S. taxpayers' money. This is something which is, I think, very dear to his heart. He wants to save U.S. taxpayers' money. He doesn't want to assist foreign countries. He's ready to consider serious cuts in the U.S. contributions to the United Nations. And it's not about charity. He believes that Biden was too generous and that the money that the United States has allocated was not properly used, that there was no due diligence, no scrutiny, and now he wants to investigate how the money was actually used, and he wants to get something from return. That's why they are talking about this rare earth deal with Ukraine, and this is another complication that they have with Kyiv. So taking everything together, I think he considers Ukraine to be a burden, and he wants to somehow take the burden off his shoulders.
So, Andrew, do you foresee a quick resolution to the crisis, in order to, let's say, restore the diplomatic ties fully with Moscow? And the U.S. officials has talked about, let's say, lifting the sanctions from the European side, from the U.S. side. once a peace deal is reached. Do you foresee there's a quick arrival of that kind of outcome?
Well, I think that the easiest and the most natural thing to do is to restore channels of communications. It doesn't require any concessions from either side. The fact is that indeed the US embassy in Moscow and the Russian embassy in Washington are like besieged fortresses. They cannot operate in a normal way. As a Russian, I cannot get a US visa in my country. I have to travel to somewhere else. And this is what has to be done. If you take sanctions, of course, sanctions are much more complicated because, first of all, not all the sanctions are executive orders. Some of them were imposed by the US Congress, and you need a decision on the Capitol Hill to lift or to change sanctions. And second, arguably even more importantly, some of the sanctions which are probably most important for Russia are sanctions imposed by the European Union. And the European Union is not eager to remove these sanctions, even if the United States does its part of the job. So sanctions, I think, is a long process. But what would be important from the Russian viewpoint is to change the momentum and to make sure that we hit the bottom and that gradually, maybe very slowly, but gradually, we are getting back to some kind of a normal diplomatic relation with the United States and arguably with the US partners at a later stage.
So, Anton, as Andrew said, some of the sanctions were made by the Congress, so they require the congressional approval if the Trump government wants to lift them. Do you foresee any opposition from the Congress to that end?
Plenty. I don't think that the congressionally mandated sanctions will be lifted anytime soon. But the Russians have adapted to them. And miraculously, for the past 2 years, Russia has had the fastest growing economy in Europe per IMF figures. So would the Russians prefer to have them lifted? Yes. Is this going to be easy to do? Absolutely not. And I doubt that Donald Trump is going to waste his political capital. He's already spending an awful lot of it just in the first month of his presidency on domestic issues. So I think the sanctions are here to stay. But as we've seen, they've had no effect on the decision making in the Kremlin, be it towards Ukraine or anything else. But they have had an unintended consequences, which is to push the Russians towards the Chinese and to diversify the Russian economy and to make it sort of more interoperable with the global South. And if you judge by the long line of countries that are waiting to join the BRICS Forum, this diversification has brought its own benefits, albeit at the cost of a severing of ties with the West. We'll see how this develops, but sanctions, or rather the promise to lift them, are not going to have a major effect on Russian decision-making from here on.
Well, Peter, what are the European leaders doing right now? Are they still pinning their hope on Washington, trying to persuade, Trump officials to change their mind, or they are determined to take action? You mentioned the Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK. They are ready to send the troops to the Ukraine. What are other countries to follow him?
They're not ready, and they're in a state of confusion. Maybe some are in a state of denial, but there are fewer of those by the day. And I hope to see following the extra curricular meeting by heads of state in Paris that Macron convened. This is the start to some very quick thinking about what to do in the absence of America's support. And America's essential, and I agree with the professor, America's essential just neglect of NATO, anything just short of leaving NATO, but basically just neutralizing its effect and decreasing its effectiveness and therefore neutralizing it altogether. So in these conditions, I think Europeans need to start thinking about their alternative security structures that would guarantee and extend security guarantee to Ukraine.
Professor Brückner, if you look at the impact, say, of course, on Russia, on Ukraine, the European Union, what about its impact on the relationship between Washington and Brussels? European officials, let's say, used to have close allies with Washington. Now there's a rift. And what's the future? Can they get over with it, over the Ukraine issue?
Well, it hasn't really sunken in what has changed recently. And what we got in the Munich Security Conference last weekend was a clear statement of everyone who represented the current US government that they took very personally that Europeans took sides in the election campaign to hope that the Biden team would continue in a variation, but being the last transatlantic government that thinks also in terms of what's important for the Europeans. This is over, and now it's time for revenge. And if Europeans want something, they have to pay for it, as Ukraine has to pay retrospectively for the support of the United States. So everything is now a matter of power play, and you can set rules and give orders and send questionnaires, and others have to fill it out. So the relationship is fundamentally different. And as I said in the beginning, I think that this is the end of NATO as we know it. And therefore, we live in different times and people have to understand the consequences. But I fully agree with Peter's diagnosis. Most Europeans haven't fully understood what that means.
Professor, what is the new world like? I mean, for the European countries, let's say.
Well, we saw already at the beginning of the war that this leads, with a grain of salt, to an increasing dependency of Russia on China, and the Europeans become more dependent on the United States. That has been a choice since the end of World War II, that Pax Americana could be seen as something, and we could happily develop our welfare system under the nuclear umbrella of the United States. This is now over. You have to pay for everything. And I expected Trump to invest in a functioning NATO and rather get rid of the North Atlantic part of it, because the end game is America versus China. And what is happening in Europe is bothering Trump, but he doesn't really care. He wants to be remembered as the peacemaker who settles the Middle East conflict and who settles Ukraine, and will be remembered as the master who could end wars within 24 hours. But what is actually interesting for him is the relationship with China.
Well, Anton, now the third anniversary of the conflict, the crisis, is there anything we can learn, probably to avoid a future conflict or war from the Ukraine crisis?
Oh, definitely. One is that slamming doors diplomatically on each other never achieves any kind of victory. And number two, that fundamental respect and the ability to listen to countries' vital national security interests is always a much more intelligent and adult way to approach international relations than to resort to military force, sanctions, and weaponizing financial systems, which ends up simply damaging the countries that weaponize them.
Well, let's hope for the best with the years to come. On that, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Qin Duo. See you next time.